This may surprise you now, but at the time, some people thought he was a fool. A few even said he wasn't very smart, but he believed what he was doing was right, and I always had faith in him. And now, so many years later, people admire my husband, Ronald Reagan, for the courage to say, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Since the late 1940s, there was great tension between the Soviet Union and our country. This time was known as the Cold War. Each country had many nuclear weapons, and if one country started a war, the two countries, maybe even the world, could have been destroyed. It was a scary time. Soviet leaders said the United States was weak and would be forced to accept communism. For many years until Ronnie became president, American presidents tried not to provoke the Soviets. This policy was called détente, and it outraged Ronnie, as he thought it made our country weak. When Ronnie was president, Russia, which was then the Soviet Union, was a communist superpower. West Germany and Western Europe had freedom, while East Germany and Eastern Europe were controlled by the communists. The Berlin Wall divided Germany, and armed Soviet soldiers made sure no East German would escape to freedom. The Berlin Wall became the symbol of the Cold War. Ronnie, well, he saw the world in terms of good and evil. He valued freedom and hated communism. Back in 1964, when he was still an actor, he gave a powerful speech on television. He said, "We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness." He believed our country needed to be willing to risk nuclear war in order to have freedom. Ronnie had been president for only 69 days when a man tried to kill him. A bullet barely missed his heart, and Ronnie almost died. After he recovered, he felt God spared his life for a special purpose, and whatever time he had left was for God. Maybe ending the Cold War was his special purpose. He wanted to be remembered as a peacemaker. He said, "I want to eliminate that awful fear that the world could be destroyed through a nuclear holocaust." He gave many speeches and spoke frequently about the evils of communism. He even referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. This made many people very uncomfortable, as they believed he was escalating the Cold War. Then, he announced to America that he was moving forward with the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. SDI was to be a defense shield in space, using laser technology to shoot down nuclear missiles. Ronnie believed this could eliminate nuclear war. The Soviets feared we would strike first, and they would be unable to strike back. Several experts said this technology was impossible, but the Soviets didn't know if our SDI program had real value. Ronnie spent a lot of money to build up our military and weapons, but the Soviets were in a war in Afghanistan and couldn't keep up with our spending. Ronnie absolutely was escalating the Cold War to try to bring about change. That change, he believed, would be peace. During his first term, Ronnie didn't meet with any of the Soviet leaders. He was strengthening our country as he believed that peace would come through strength, and it's hard to negotiate when you are seen as weak. Then, Mikhail Gorbachev came into power. He was so different from the other Soviet leaders. Ronnie and Mr. Gorbachev met in person for the first time in the 1985 summit. Ronnie suggested they take a walk alone without their advisors. The two men talked for an hour. This was the beginning of a very important relationship. They agreed on some things, but not on SDI, which was a big concern for the Soviets. They agreed to meet again and avoid nuclear war. Ronnie liked Mr. Gorbachev. He even sent him some of these. Then, at the next year's summit, the men were working to eliminate some weapons. But when Gorbachev talked about limiting SDI, Ronnie refused and walked away from the negotiations. SDI was not close to reality, but Ronnie's reaction must have made Gorbachev worry about its progress. Of course, The media called the summit a failure, but me, I call it a success. Ronnie was right where he wanted to be, negotiating from a position of strength. On June 12th, 1987, he gave that famous speech at the Berlin Wall. Ronnie shocked the world when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Advisors told him not to say it, as it might provoke the Soviets. Well, I was in the crowd that day, and I can tell you the people were excited. Ronnie was interrupted 28 times by cheers. Then, Gorbachev visited the U.S., and the men were working to eliminate some weapons. And the following year, Ronnie visited Moscow, where Russians lined the streets to cheer for him. Shortly after Ronnie left office, Gorbachev announced his country would abandon communism and become a democracy. And on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Excited Germans danced in the streets. Ronnie, who many thought was a right-wing kook, was called a hero. He was nicknamed the Great Communicator. He believed, not because he had great style or words, but because he communicated great things. In 1994, Ronnie was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And 10 years later, the love of my life joined his maker. The media, who once doubted him, praised him. Gorbachev credited him with ending the Cold War and called him a great president. Former English Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said, "Ronald Reagan had a higher claim than any other leader to have won the Cold War for liberty. And he did it without a shot being fired." Of course, every great man has his critics. Some say that the Soviet Union would have collapsed eventually without Ronald Reagan, or that Mikhail Gorbachev always planned to end communism in Russia. Others say my husband wasted billions of taxpayer dollars. And still, some critics say all of those nuclear weapons were unnecessary and caused significant damage to the environment. Russia and the United States combined still have about 23,000 nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, Ronnie and Mr. Gorbachev were unable to accomplish destruction of most weapons. But at least we don't have those weapons aimed at each other anymore. Some critics say that the surplus of weapons made the world a more dangerous place, and that the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the possibility that some weapons may be sold illegally to terrorists. To all of those critics, I say that we will never know what would have happened in this world if Ronnie had not changed the way we dealt with the Soviet Union. He lived his life and led our country according to his strong moral convictions. He was incredibly optimistic, and as I've often said, he was absolutely without guile. He was kind and he was genuine, and he assumed others were like that too. And now, we understand it was his unique personality that enabled this former actor to play the best role of his life. The U.S. president who ended the Cold War. He is remembered the way he wanted to be remembered. As a president who brought peace to the world.